There are some races in motorsport history that mean very different things to different fans. As we saw earlier this season in Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys, the 2001 Daytona 500 may be a very bittersweet moment of success for a Michael Waltrip fan after so many missed opportunities. But for a Dale Earnhardt fan, the 2001 Daytona 500 is likely one of the worst days of their life. This month on Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys, I want to turn my eye to Formula One to dig deep into one of those races, the 1975 Spanish Grand Prix. As time has passed, I find that this race has acquired a strange dual history depending on who you speak to about it. For those interested in safety, the 1975 Spanish Grand Prix was a horrific and easily preventable tragedy. Drivers threatened to boycott the event after they arrived to discover safety barriers literally tied together with rope, and to no one's surprise, those shoddy barriers couldn't withstand the brute force of a Formula One car spinning out of control, and 4 people were killed as a result of organizer negligence. But if you are someone who turns a closer eye to the roles that women have played in the racing world, then the 1975 Spanish Grand Prix has an element of triumph to it. There, a promising Italian racer finished in 6th place, the final points-paying position of that era. Her name was Lella Lombardi, and over the 5 decades that have passed since that time, she remains the only woman to have scored points in a Formula One Grand Prix and the most recent woman to actually compete in a Formula One weekend. While I don't think the tragedy of that weekend should discount the nature of her accomplishment, I do tend to find that the tragedy is what gets passed over during celebrations of women in motorsport. This month, my goal is to tie all of those various threads together in order to have a much deeper understanding of what happened at the 1975 Spanish Grand Prix. We'll look at organizational incompetence, changing attitudes towards safety, the roles women played in racing, and critically, how all of those elements blended together on that tragic day in Spain to create one of the most conflicted events in racing history. On top of that, we'll also have some quotes from none other than Mario Andretti, who was there that weekend and who witnessed both the tragedy and the triumph of the 1975 Spanish Grand Prix. Motorsport has always existed on a razor-thin edge, where brilliance meets obsession and the pursuit of speed sends great men to their graves. Behind the podiums and champagne, behind the PR gloss and corporate smiles, racing has always carried its share of somber secrets. Welcome to Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys, an award-winning motorsport history podcast dedicated to uncovering the scandals, tragedies, and intrigues that transformed the racing world in ways the record books have long tried to forget. I'm motorsport journalist and historian Elizabeth Blackstock, and in each episode, I return to the archives, examining interviews, court documents, original reporting, and eyewitness accounts to reconstruct how these forgotten events unfolded. I want to know the motivations, the conflicts, and the consequences, which reveal how personal ambition and organizational pressure collided in often fatal ways that altered motorsport forever. These are our deadly passions, our terrible joys. For most of early motorsport history, the concept of safety was dramatically different from how we would consider it today. In contemporary terms, we see safety in a very multifaceted light, where we want to prevent harm from coming to drivers, team members, spectators, media, track workers, and anyone else who may end up near a racing surface. We recognize racing is dangerous, but we want to minimize that harm to whatever extent possible. But for much of early racing history, safety was really only a thing race organizers cared about when it came to spectators, if they cared at all. It was assumed that drivers not only understood the risk that racing carried, but that they tacitly accepted that risk every time they got behind the wheel. If a driver were to die while competing, well, he knew what he was getting into, the same way that a Roman gladiator knew he was going to die when he battled a lion. It could still be a tragedy. It could still have impacts that rippled beyond the track, but no one was really doing anything to prevent it. That mindset persisted for decades, even into the start of the Formula One era in 1950. But as that decade progressed, we started to see changes for a variety of reasons. For one thing, motorsport was becoming more professionalized, and that started to change driver expectations. See, during the first decades of racing, motorsport wasn't really a career. It was more of a hobby for rich folks than anything else, and the people who were making a living from it were usually connected to automakers who relied on expertise that these drivers offered in improving automotive technology. There also weren't many major championships with huge prize purses that linked together performance in a variety of races. So there was not this institutional pressure for a driver to compete in every single race on offer. In 1932, if you thought the Nürburgring was just too dangerous, you could not race there. You could just decline, and it wouldn't necessarily have major repercussions down the line, at least as far as a championship is concerned. If you did race there, though, it was assumed you had accepted that risk. The introduction of a cohesive championship also introduced the pressure to compete in events that you maybe wouldn't have if you weren't trying to score points over the full course of a year. It is worth noting that in the first decades of F1, drivers were not expected to compete in every race, and the championship points system was designed to reflect that. In 1950, for example, the full F1 calendar consisted of 7 scheduled events, but only 4 results would count toward the championship. If you skipped the Belgian Grand Prix, for example, it wouldn't necessarily count against you because that could be one of the 3 races that you just didn't count towards your end of season total. That leeway shrinks a little bit when you remember that the Indianapolis 500 was one of those 7 scheduled events on that calendar at that point. And in the 11-year period where the 500 counted toward the F1 championship, only 2 Grand Prix drivers actually attempted that race. So for most folks, that was one event right off the bat that you were not going to count. Naturally, it still benefited drivers to compete in every race because it was your 4 best finishes that counted toward the title. Cars were still pretty unreliable at this point, so even a very dominant driver and a very decent car could expect to suffer some mechanical issues at some point during the year. If that happens when you intend to compete in every race, it's less of a big deal because you still have several more opportunities to finish well and score points. But if you retire from a race when you only intend to compete in 4 of the 7 total events of the year, then you just shot yourself in the foot. As F1 progressed, that pressure to compete in all of these events only grew because the amount of money at stake kept increasing. The introduction of the Constructors' Championship brought greater pressure from teams to have drivers winning in every event, and the introduction of sponsors added contractual and financial obligations to do so as well. There was more and more riding on a driver turning up to race and to perform well in that race. Technology was also advancing and cars were growing quicker, but not everyone understood why certain improvements worked. Adding wings meant an increase in downforce and therefore speed. Teams kind of figured that out, but they still weren't sure what to build the wings out of or where to mount them, how to angle them, and so many more different variables that we could run simulations on today, but that they were figuring out live on the track. Circuits kind of went in the opposite direction. They didn't feel that need to innovate. The way they saw it, the track was the track. It was the steady variable in the ever-evolving world of Formula One. It wasn't the track that was unsafe. It was the cars. And if drivers didn't like how dangerous their cars were, well, then they just didn't need to compete. Or maybe they could drive slower. Or they could ask their team to fix things. Of course, the drivers disagreed with this assessment. They felt that they brought something unique to the team. They were professionals providing a service. Yes, they benefited from performing well, but those benefits would disappear as soon as they were severely injured or dead. But there was still this persistent belief elsewhere in the sport that drivers were admittedly replaceable. Team bosses would stand by their drivers to a certain extent, but eventually they would demand those drivers suck it up and drive. With ever more money on the line, team owners and race promoters often had a pretty low tolerance for drivers who demanded a pause in the action to address something like a potholed track surface or a shoddy barrier. And drivers began to understand that the only way to have their voices heard was to make a collective stance. Those were the conflicting mindsets held by different factions of the sport as Formula One arrived in Montjuïc Park for the 1975 Spanish Grand Prix. The history of motorsport in Spain is absolutely fascinating, and we can trace it all the way back to the very start of the 20th century, when cars were just beginning to become a little more prevalent on roadways around the world. In 1903, for example, Madrid was pinpointed as the end destination for an 800-mile race that started in Versailles. If you're familiar with that race, the Paris-Madrid, then you know that it was called to an end well before participants even had a chance to leave France's borders as a result of the sheer number of fatalities. But those major city-to-city racing events had grown in popularity, and Spain wanted to be included in that conversation. A few years later, Spain was organizing its own major motorsport events within its own borders. In 1908, it was hosting a race on public roads called the Copa Catalunya. The track in question was a 17-mile affair that started in Sitges, a town that we will revisit in a moment, and it ran inland, though poor road conditions meant the event moved to a 9-mile road course that started north of Barcelona instead. Other street-based events followed. The Peñarín Grand Prix took place at a street circuit in the Vilafranca de Penedès, while the first actual purpose-built circuit came in the form of the Autodrome de Sitges-Terramar. Now, Sitges is fascinating for a lot of reasons. For one thing, it was only one small part of an overall project called the Terramar Residential Development. That development was designed to be this self-contained coastal garden city inspired by places like Nice, France. Developers imagined sprawling villas, mansions, lots of green space, a casino, a hotel, and even a golf course. With motorsport growing in popularity, adding a racetrack to this development seemed like a real easy win. Sitges-Terramar got under construction early in 1923 and was built in just 300 days, so its first race took place later that same year. That brings us to another fascinating element of this circuit. It's banking. See, Sitges was kind of this bean-shaped oval track, and as is the case with many oval tracks, its corners were banked in order to allow for higher speeds. Except no one really had any idea what a normal amount of banking should look like, so the architects of the track added in 66 degrees of banking. 66 degrees. For a little contrast, Talladega Superspeedway is considered to have pretty dramatic banking today, and its corners are only banked to 33 degrees. When Monza built its oval track, its banking didn't even crest 40 degrees. And if you've ever seen images of the old Sitges track, you will notice that directly perpendicular to the bottom edge of the racing surface is a giant wall. Early racers literally had to drive flat out over this section in order to maintain enough momentum to avoid tipping over and rolling into the wall. Unfortunately, the track only managed to host a single international event before it was banned from hosting international competitions. As it turned out, building a racetrack that quickly and then immediately hosting a racing event used up a whole lot more money than anyone was expecting. The company that built the track had not been paid by the developers by the time the first race went off, so they arrived at the gate and seized the money made from the ticket fees from the first event to repay their debts. That meant that race organizers didn't have any money left over to pay the drivers the advertised victory fee, and so Sitges-Terramar was banned from international competition. It did host a few national races for a few years after before ultimately closing, but if you go to Spain today, you can still see this circuit. It does still exist. 1923 also saw the introduction of another track in Spain, this time returning to the country's street circuit roots. This new circuit began in the wooded Montjuïc Park, located on a hill above the city of Barcelona's harbor in what had once been the ideal location for medieval forts. By 1933, the track was shortened to focus primarily on the Montjuïc Park region when it would hold the Peñarín Grand Prix. By the time Formula One arrived, the track had been trimmed down to just 2.35 miles, but that short distance shouldn't imply that it was a simple circuit, not by any means. First and foremost, this track was run counterclockwise, which is the opposite compared to most other Formula One events raced at the time. And not only was it absolutely gorgeous, but it was an extremely difficult and even more dangerous track to drive. That was despite the fact that the Royal Automobile Club of Spain and the Spanish government had worked to revamp the track. See, in 1955, the Spanish Grand Prix, then taking place at the wide Pedralbes street circuit in Barcelona, was cancelled. That was due to the crash at the 24 Hours of Le Mans that killed over 80 spectators. That specific incident forced the world of motorsport to kind of pause and think more deeply about safety than it ever had before, particularly as it pertained to keeping fans safe. In a lot of cases, race organizers looked at their tracks and felt they were simply not up to par. That then resulted in a slew of race cancellations, not so much because organizers decided motorsport should never be held again, but because they wanted an opportunity to figure out the safest way to proceed forward, to implement those changes, and then to go back racing. For Spain, the 1955 cancellation actually ended up resulting in the Spanish Grand Prix falling off the F1 calendar for over a decade. Racing still happened in the country, but Formula One wouldn't come back until the very late 1960s. In 1967, Spain made the determination that it wanted to come back to the international racing scene, and it did so in a big way. First came the construction of the Jarama circuit. This track was located north of Madrid, and it's a purpose-built permanent facility that earned a slot on the Formula One calendar in 1968. But Spain had also struck a deal with Formula One that would see it alternate racetracks. See, the Spanish government had poured a whole ton of money into the refurbishment of the Montjuïc Park street circuit, and it wanted to see that investment pay off by having it host a Grand Prix. The alternation between Jarama and Montjuïc Park was almost necessary, just in terms of the quality of the racing as well. Even though Jarama was a permanent purpose-built circuit, it turned out to be a pretty slow racetrack. The racing surface was narrow and the layout itself was super twisty, so cars couldn't mount a ton of speed as they drove around, and they also really struggled to overtake. Montjuïc Park may have been a fairly narrow street circuit, but its layout featured far fewer tight turns. Drivers could therefore sweep around this wooded region and gain some pretty impressive speed in the process. The track also had a ton of character, and for many pundits, it remains one of their favorite street circuits in all of Formula One history. Legendary journalist Nigel Roebuck described Montjuïc as the greatest street circuit I ever saw. Imagine Monaco, but with more variety of turn and gradient, and much faster, and some flavor of Montjuïc Park should then emerge. Mario Andretti also very much enjoyed racing at this track.
I always love the elevations on the track.
Yeah, it's so cool.
It gives you, it provides a very special challenge that I always embrace. I always liked a very bumpy track because anybody can drive on a smooth track. So if there was something unusual like that, you figure that's something that psychologically, if I conquer that, I have an advantage. And so the elevation is, I love that. I love it because, again, I felt that it, during that particular race, actually I had a good handle on it. Mm-hmm. I had a good rhythm and everything else. So my memory of that race actually was positive.
And it is Montjuïc Park where today's tale will take place. But before I talk about the events that transpired at the 1975 Spanish Grand Prix, I need to introduce you to a few of our key players. As we've talked about here plenty of times on Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys, women have been a part of the racing scene for as long as cars have existed. The big driver behind their lack of participation in major racing series has stemmed more from institutional discouragement than from any individual lack of interest. And that's why, in Formula One, there have only been 2 women to start a Grand Prix. The second of those women, and one of the topics of our episode today, is Lella Lombardi. Now, we spoke briefly about Lombardi in the DPTJ episode titled 1977 Firecracker 400, NASCAR's Attempt to Discredit Women, but her life warrants a deeper dive here because we're talking about her within a Formula One context. Born in 1941 to a working-class family in Frugarolo, Italy, Maria Grazia Lombardi got her start behind the wheel in a pretty humble fashion. Her father was a butcher, and he needed someone to drive the family's delivery van. It may not have been glamorous, but it was more than enough to prove to her that she had a passion and a talent for driving. In the competitive world, Lombardi got started in go-karting when she was still quite young, and then bought her first proper race car in 1965. That car was a rudimentary open-wheel machine for a small series called Formula Monza, which was priced at about $1,400 USD at the time. It gave her the initial experience she needed, and in 1968 she advanced to Formula 3, where a second-place finish convinced her family, finally, that she had the talent it required to pursue racing as a viable career path. She became champion of the Italian Formula 850 series in 1970, and in 1974 she signed with the Shell Sport Luxembourg Lola team in the Formula 5000 series. She finished 5th in the championship. That same year, 1974, marked a major turning point for Lombardi. That junior open-wheel success prompted her to enter a private Brabham in the 1974 British Grand Prix. She had some financial backing from the Automobile Club d'Italia and Radio Luxembourg Broadcasting, but she failed to qualify for the race, in part because her Brabham BT42 was out of date and ill-prepared. But it still gave her a feather in her cap, one that caught the eye of a nobleman named Count Gugi Zenon. Zenon had exactly the connections that Lombardi needed. His wife owned Lavazza Coffee at the time, so he had the money and the company required to initiate a sponsorship, and he was also well connected in Formula One. He's the man who helped fund Ronnie Peterson's career at Team Lotus in both 1972 and 1978. He would later help Ayrton Senna leave his Toleman contract in order to move to Lotus, and he was charmed by Lella Lombardi and keen to support fresh talent wherever he could. So Zenon arranged a deal. If Lombardi could find a seat for 1975, he would sponsor her via Lavazza Coffee. The seat she found was with March Engineering, a team founded in 1969 by Max Mosley, Alan Rees, Graham Coker, and Robin Hurd. March took a fairly unique approach to building race cars. It wanted to build simple and reliable cars that it could race and that it could sell to customer teams as a way to make money. As a works team, it performed reasonably well in Formula One. It also sold cars to countless other teams like Tyrrell, Williams, Hesketh, and Penske, among plenty of other smaller-name privateers. And perhaps just as important, March was often the first landing place for aspiring F1 drivers who were able to turn up with a handsome sponsor paycheck. When Lombardi approached them with the pitch, they agreed to give her a seat for most of the 1975 season. Lombardi did not attend the first two races in Argentina and Brazil, so her Formula One debut was at the third race of the 1975 season, the South African Grand Prix in Kyalami. By doing so, she became the first woman since Maria Teresa de Filippis to enter a Grand Prix weekend, then the first to qualify for and start the race. She qualified 26th, which was dead last among the cars that qualified, and she retired with a fuel system failure on lap 26 of 78. Reporters were quick to point out her presence because that was a natural storyline. But Lombardi never saw her gender as something worth giving any sort of special attention. After that race in South Africa, she told a journalist, "I hope that now people have begun to understand that Lella Lombardi is a racer who is a woman, rather than a woman who races. That is a distinction I care about very much." She would double down on that later in 1975, telling Autosport, "I never considered the male-female issue, only the competition that exists between different drivers. Under the helmet, men and women are completely equal." Her first Grand Prix start may not have gone to plan, but Lombardi could hold her head up high as the F1 circus returned to Europe. At the next race, the 1975 Spanish Grand Prix, she would have another chance to learn and grow, this time on a bumpy street circuit that tended to level the playing field between the fastest cars and the backmarkers. There's one final piece we need to discuss before we dig deeper into the 1975 Spanish Grand Prix. We need to talk briefly about the Embassy Hill team. Embassy Racing with Graham Hill was a Formula One team that debuted in 1973. Two-time champion Graham Hill walked away from the Brabham Racing team at the end of 1972, both frustrated and overwhelmed. Over the course of 2 years, he had only scored 6 points. And having recently turned 43 years old, he knew that his time in the sport and his appeal to team bosses was limited. But Graham Hill still firmly believed he had more to give. So he decided to do what any sensible racing driver would do. He announced that he would establish his own Formula One team. Hill had long-standing ties with the folks at Imperial Tobacco, a brand that had been involved in Formula One for years. It was the first major non-motorsport related sponsor to adorn the side pods of a Formula One car back in 1968, when it advertised its Gold Leaf brand of cigarettes on the body of the Lotus 49. Not long after, Gold Leaf gave way to John Player Special, and Hill, having raced for Lotus during the Gold Leaf era, remained in close contact with the brand and had the contacts he needed to find a prominent backer for his race team. This time around, Imperial had another cigarette brand that it wanted to promote, Embassy. Embassy would take over the naming rights of the team, while Graham Hill would start sorting out the rest with the funds at hand. Now, it's almost impossible to announce a brand new Formula One team at the end of a racing season and then have a freshly built race car ready for the following year. So Hill organized a deal to purchase components of a Shadow DN1 race car, which would also be making its debut in 1973. Shadow was new to Formula One, but it had been competing in the Can-Am series over in North America, and it had brought in guys like Tony Southgate, who had engineered for Lola Eagle and BRM, as well as Alan Rees, one of the co-founders of March Engineering. It seemed like it had a pretty strong backbone on which to build a race car. But Shadow also had quite the barrier to overcome in entering Formula One in 1973. The Argentine Grand Prix kicked off the year, and it took place at the end of January, which was followed by the Brazilian Grand Prix in February. And the DN1 simply was not finished in time to pack it onto a ship and send it over to South America. Shadow missed the first two races of the 1973 season. It had two cars ready for the South African Grand Prix that would take place in March, but those cars went to its two works drivers, Jackie Oliver and George Fulmer. Embassy was a customer team, and it would not receive its first DN1 chassis until Spain in late April. And there were other problems. Tony Southgate had engineering experience, yes, but he had most recently been designing cars around BRM's V12 engines, and Shadow was going to use a Ford Cosworth V8 DFV. Well, George Fulmer had a frankly impressive start to the season with a 6th place finish in South Africa and a 3rd place in Spain. The DN1 had a tendency to vibrate itself into failure and subsequently retirement. And because Embassy was a customer team, it didn't have Tony Southgate on hand to make improvements between the chassis and the engine. Hill, the only driver on the Embassy Hill team, only managed a best finish of 9th in 1973, and at that time, 9th place was worth no points. Now, that is obviously not what Graham Hill had in mind when he set out to build his own race team. So for 1974, he contacted Lola and commissioned them to build a car specifically for his team. This car, called the Lola T370, was largely based on Lola's racing machines for the Formula 5000 series. Because Lola was at this point a pretty prolific car builder, Hill had the first example of the T370 on his hands to start testing before the end of the 1973 F1 season. That way, when 1974 kicked off in Argentina in January, he had two cars that were tested and ready to race, one for Hill and one for newly signed driver Guy Edwards. Was this Lola more successful than the Shadow DN1? Not really. Graham Hill did indeed manage to finish 6th at the Swedish Grand Prix, and in doing so brought home 1 point, but that was the only point the team scored that year. So, Graham Hill decided it's time to try again. The Lola T370 had been built by a man named Andy Smallman, and Smallman was also in charge of building its successor, the T371, for 1975. But at some point, Embassy decided that it wanted to elevate itself from customer team to outright constructor, and Smallman joined Embassy. He brought with him the plans to build a modified version of the T371, which they would name the GH1. But the GH1 would have to wait to make its debut because, once again, a car was not ready in time for the start of the 1975 season. Hill and Rolf Stommelin, who had replaced Guy Edwards after Edwards injured his wrist during a Formula 5000 race just before the British Grand Prix in 1974, would start the year with the Lola from the season prior. Stommelin would have the honor of debuting the GH1 in South Africa, the 3rd race of the season, and it immediately showed promise. While Stommelin never actually contested for victory, he did come home in 7th place, the final car on the lead lap, and in the upper half of the 17 listed finishers. Heading off to Europe, there was reason to be hopeful. The next race would be the 1975 Spanish Grand Prix. In his race report for Motorsport magazine, journalist Dennis Jenkinson begins his discussion of the 1975 Spanish Grand Prix by saying, "We should have seen the writing on the wall when the transporters carrying the Formula One circus crossed the frontier into Spain with little or no trouble, unlike previous years where there had been long delays and muddles over paperwork." It would not take long before that ease turned to disaster. Today, you can expect preparations for a Grand Prix to kick off months in advance of the race, particularly when it comes to a street circuit, but that wasn't always the case. When the F1 field arrived in sunny Spain for that fateful 1975 event, they discovered plenty of Armco barriers and wire netting lining the track, but those barriers and netting were not properly installed. When the clock ticked over to officially kick off Friday practice, nearly every single driver was on the track, but not in their cars. Reigning world champion Emerson Fittipaldi had amassed the members of the Grand Prix Drivers Association to make a tour of the track on foot, pointing out a variety of problems with the supposed safety features of the track. At first glance, everything had been erected and was in its proper place. But when you actually looked at how those safety features were erected, you would find problems. Peek behind an Armco barrier, for example, and you'd be likely to notice that the bolts holding the pieces of metal together had not been properly fixed. In some places, they were finger tight, which meant that they were loosely twisted into place by hand, instead of being properly affixed with a wrench. In other places, there were no bolts at all. There was nothing actually keeping the barrier attached to other parts of the barrier or to the uprights designed to hold them in place. Now, loose guardrails may seem like a pretty simple problem, but they were no laughing matter. In 1973 and 1974, drivers Francois Sevier and Helmut Koenig were both killed at Watkins Glen. They crashed into the track's signature baby blue Armco barriers at two different locations, but the barriers had not been properly secured. Sevier was quartered by the brutality of the impact. Koenig was beheaded. The drivers who witnessed these incidents and their aftermaths were horrified. No one wanted to be next. And as the drivers walked the track, they found that this was a consistent problem. It was not limited to one section. Damn near every barrier was faulty. These drivers were not going to get behind the wheel. I've also read race reports that the drivers faced issues with catch fencing and barriers at the race prior, the South African Grand Prix, though I haven't been able to corroborate that. But if it was the case, that's yet another reason to demand changes at Montjuïc Park before anyone hit the track. Emerson Fittipaldi called the drivers together to meet in the Texaco caravan and discuss what they wanted to do next. One thing I find interesting about this is the way that driver meeting is described by Dennis Jenkinson. He writes, "Without doubt, the steel barriers were substandard as regard their fixings, but instead of driving at substandard speeds or personally explaining the situation to the paying public, the drivers held a GPDA meeting in the Texaco caravan, gathering in the non-GPDA drivers as well, and went on strike until something was done." It's this kind of strange acknowledgement that while there was a problem, the drivers were seen to be going about fixing it in a completely incorrect way, though it's kind of hard to know exactly what else they were supposed to do. There wasn't much to be done immediately, and eventually non-GPDA drivers like Jackie Ickx were tired of the equivocating. Ickx left the meeting, claiming that the drivers were talking without saying anything, and hit the track in his Lotus 72 for a handful of laps around 4 p.m. Only one other driver recorded a time during that session. When F1 practice was declared over, then a local series called Formula C 1800 went out for its practice session. So any fixes that were going to happen were delayed even further. Overnight, Spanish Grand Prix organizers sent a handful of track workers out to take a stab at fixing the barriers, but their numbers were limited. After all, we are talking about 5 total miles of barrier when you take into account both sides of the 2.5-mile track, and that track was double-lined. This was a job that obviously should have been underway weeks prior. It's not something you can accomplish with a couple of guys overnight. So because of that, when the F1 field arrived to continue practice on Saturday, it was to a track that had hardly been made any safer. Emerson Fittipaldi was furious, and he started to demand that race organizers cancel the race outright if they weren't going to make any legitimate efforts to change these circumstances. The hemming and hawing continued. GPDA-affiliated drivers refused to hit the track for practice, and it prompted a slew of folks from Formula One itself to grab their wrenches and start working on the barriers. We're talking mechanics, team members, sponsors, and even team owners like Ken Tyrrell, Colin Chapman, and Max Mosley. They wanted to go racing, and it was clear the only way to do so safely was to prepare the track themselves. But again, there is only so much they can do. The F1 circus focused primarily on what they identified as the problem areas or the parts of the track where they felt it would be most likely for an accident to happen or a collision to take place. FIA stewards examined the track and determined that it had satisfied 90% of the contemporary standards for circuit safety, so they announced practice would begin. Team owners, too, were pretty content with the way things looked. The GPDA drivers were still not happy with what they saw. Once again, Ickx hit the track to practice, and he was joined this time by the likes of Bob Evans and Roelof van der Rink. According to Motorsport magazine, Evans still didn't like the look of the guardrails at a certain part of the track, but rather than not practice, he simply chose to drive slower at that part of the circuit. But it took a fair amount of coercing to get anyone else out on track, as in, team owners started threatening to cancel contracts or to pay their drivers less money, while others basically just started dragging their drivers out of the Texaco hauler that had become their de facto meeting point to come push them into the goddamn car. The paddock at this point in time was located inside a stadium that had been constructed for a failed Olympic bid back in the 1930s, and race organizers were now threatening to lock all of the haulers and all of the race cars inside of this stadium, then sue because the F1 field was failing to fulfill its contract. It was really only at this point that drivers finally conceded it was time to compete. Again, things did not really kick off properly until 4 p.m., and at this point now the pressure was on. Practice couldn't stretch on forever, it was about to get dark, and drivers also needed to start setting flying laps to count for their qualifying times. Amidst a chorus of catcalls and middle fingers from fans upset that they'd been deprived of proper F1 action for 2 days, lap times began to fall. Then, in the closing moments of this session, something happened that everyone had been fearing. One driver, Patrick Depailler, lost control of his car and clobbered a barrier, and nothing happened. The barrier didn't fall apart. Depailler's Tyrrell didn't vault over it or fly into the crowd or pierce the barrier. The barrier collected the car, the driver was unhurt, and marshals were able to remove the wreck with ease. Qualifying concluded with Niki Lauda on pole, just a tenth of a second ahead of his Ferrari teammate Clay Regazzoni, with a time of 1 minute and 23.4 seconds per lap. In protest, Emerson Fittipaldi set an extremely slow lap, with his qualifying time of 2 minutes and 10.2 seconds good enough for 26th or last on the grid. Clearly, there was still unease about this event taking place, and it carried through the evening, even as track workers once again descended to check bolts and barriers before race day. For her own part, Lella Lombardi qualified 24th of 26 cars, though the two drivers who had qualified behind her were two of the drivers most vocal about protesting track conditions. They were ones who had chosen to drive slowly. On Sunday morning, race stewards gave the track the okay and deemed the barriers acceptable. Yet there were still drivers who remained unconvinced that organizers had actually done enough in their power to secure the circuit's safety, and reigning world champion Emerson Fittipaldi even threatened that he wouldn't start the race. Fittipaldi's brother Wilson and Arturo Merzario joined in that threat, and a few other drivers were said to be on the fence about going on with the race too. If you are wondering why anyone would even consider starting the 1975 Spanish Grand Prix knowing how dangerous the barriers were, we can point to a lot of varying factors that could have come into play. Again, in F1's first decades, drivers effectively had to race with a sense of willful ignorance. Death was omnipresent. They knew that at least one, if not more, of their colleagues would be killed by the conclusion of a season, but those drivers also couldn't believe that they could be killed. Otherwise, they may very well have been too terrified to even get behind the wheel of a car. That's not to say that these drivers were totally unaffected, even as they tried to ignore the specter of death. Three-time world champion Jackie Stewart, for example, suffered from severe stress ulcers in his final years of Formula One. They left him doubled over in pain. Stewart had miraculously only suffered one truly awful crash in his career, but he had lost countless friends: Jim Clark, Jochen Rindt, and Francois Sever. Stewart had been personally racked by loss, and the more he raced, the more conscious he became of the fact that he could very well end up putting his family in the same situation. And then there were other drivers who actually seemed to laugh in the face of danger. Men like Jackie Ickx. Now, Jackie Ickx is a very complex man. At the 24 Hours of Le Mans, in 1969, he staged a protest against the standard Le Mans-style start of the race, where drivers were tasked with running across the track and jumping into their cars, then starting them and launching onto the track and beating and banging their way into the first lap, usually without having secured their seatbelts. Ickx thought that start style was absurd, and so in 1969, he strolled calmly across the track, buckled his seatbelt, and took off in a safe and timely manner in order to prove that drivers didn't need to be so reckless at the start of a 24-hour race. As it would turn out, he won. But in Formula One, Ickx took a very different tack. I don't want to go so far as to say that he was anti-safety, because I don't think that was the case. He was quoted as saying at a different race, "Mon métier, c'est pilote de course," or "My profession is racing driver." By that, I think he means that he was always going to race regardless of the circumstances. If he felt that a circuit or practice was too dangerous, he would still race. He would just do it like he did at Le Mans, on his own terms. Ickx was often the most visible and vocal driver in that camp. You could generally count on him to be the first driver out on track during a potential boycott, but I do get the sense that he represented quite a few other drivers too. At the very least, even safety-conscious drivers had legitimate concerns about what would happen if they did not go out and race. On the extreme end, a team could end their contract. On the practical side, they wouldn't earn any starting or prize money since they wouldn't be competing. On the emotional or psychological side, most drivers had an almost Pavlovian reaction to the sound of an engine firing up. So if Jackie Ickx was starting up his car and hitting the track, more drivers were sure to follow. So that was where things stood on Sunday morning. Whether or not they thought the track was safe, the racers were going to race. The 1975 Spanish Grand Prix was scheduled to begin at 12:30 p.m., but protests continued. Organizers sent dancers and a band out before the main grandstand to keep people entertained, but the ultimate decision that day was clear. The race would go on, and teams proceeded to wheel 25 cars out onto the starting grid. 25, not 26, because Emerson Fittipaldi stuck firm to his threat, got in his airplane, and flew home. The starting flag fell almost immediately after the 30-second warning signal was given, which meant the field of surprise drivers rocketed off to the start of the race in something of a muddle. Niki Lauda and Clay Regazzoni both launched into the lead, though Mario Andretti and Vittorio Brambilla were both chasing him. There was plenty of beating and banging. Lauda retired before the first lap was over. Patrick Depailler, Mark Donohue, Alan Jones, and Jody Scheckter were all out on lap 3 with collision damage or engine failure. Wilson Fittipaldi and Arturo Merzario both completed a single lap, which was mandatory to be contractually considered to have started the race, before they pulled into the pits and withdrew. And the field continued to be whittled down as more and more drivers faced crash damage or parts failure. The car-catching quality of the barriers was repeatedly put to the test as drivers clobbered into them, and for those laps, they held. Going into lap 26, it was Rolf Stommelen in the lead, driving his Embassy Hill machine, followed closely by Carlos Pache. The two rocketed past the pit lane and mounted a hill cresting along the paddock stadium at over 150 miles per hour. But that road, Dennis Jenkinson wrote, is a long left curve, and as it approaches the brow of the hill, the cars are almost airborne. It was in that location that the rear wing of Stommelin's GH-1 Embassy Hill machine snapped. Downforce disappeared instantly from the rear wheels, and Stommelin veered across the road to pummel the barriers on the left side of the track. The barriers held, but they deflected the Embassy Hill back onto the racing surface at top speed. Carlos Pache tried desperately to avoid collecting the other car, but there was nowhere for his Brabham to go but into the barriers. Stommelin's car hit the Brabham and kept going, aimed now toward the barriers on the right side of the track. But there was a problem. The track at this point was not level. Remember, the drivers had crested a hill and were now at the top, at the point where the land was dipping back down towards sea level. The left side of this track, where Stommelin had crashed, was higher than the right side of the track. And as his Embassy Hill bounced off the left side and aimed toward the right-hand barriers at something like 130 miles per hour, he was perfectly positioned to simply skim the top level of the Armco barrier and pummel into the wire debris net. The debris net was not enough to stop its momentum, and the car tumbled into the crowd. The race continued on without pause as trackside marshals and officials uncovered the extent of the damage. Pache was entirely unhurt, and Stommelin somehow had avoided death with nothing but a broken leg, a broken wrist, and 2 cracked ribs. He was placed on a stretcher and taken to a local hospital for treatment. Under the wreckage of the Embassy Hill, they found bodies. 4 men had been killed by the machine, and 9 or 10 others were injured. The dead included a fireman named Joaquin Benaches Morera, a spectator, Andres Ruiz Villanova, and 2 photojournalists, Maria de Roya and Antonio Fontbayari. It took 4 laps before officials made the call to red flag the race, and they only did so because it was otherwise impossible to get the ambulances to the scene of the accident. During the fracas, McLaren's Jochen Mass had outpaced Jackie Exivlotis to sneak into the lead. Just behind were Carlos Reutemann, Jean-Pierre Jarier, Vittorio Brambilla, Lella Lombardi, Tony Bryce, and John Watson. They were the only 8 cars to finish the race, of the 25 that took the starting flag. When organizers tallied up the standings at the end of the 1975 Spanish Grand Prix, they discovered that the sport had made history. For the first time since its founding in 1950, Formula One saw a woman score points. I don't think it dawned on me that I was the very first woman to collect championship points, Lombardi later reflected in the New York Times. Things like that just don't bother me. I'm just as competitive as any man. Too many women perhaps feel that motor racing is essentially a masculine affair. Well, I don't agree at all. It's simply a competitive sport. There's a lot of glamour surrounding being the first girl to do well in F1, but the whole business is overrated. I love motor racing, and that's all I want to do. I'm not terribly conscious of there being a difference between male and female in this sort of thing. The thing I like is the feeling when you pass the checkered flag first. That's something I don't have any problem sharing with my male colleagues. At that time, only the top 6 finishers in a race were eligible for points. Lombardi, finishing 6th, was in the final points-paying position. But the regulations also dictated that if a race were to be ended before 60% of the distance had been completed, then you could not award full points. You could only offer half of the points that drivers would normally receive. Due to that decision, Lombardi's point for 6th place shrunk to a half a point. It remains the only points scored by a woman in Formula One to this day. In Formula One, as in many forms of motorsport, safety improvements were rare, at least until a major incident took place that forced F1, the FIA, and the team owners to acknowledge that something needed to change. And in the wake of the 1975 Spanish Grand Prix, change was swift. The next Grand Prix in the calendar was scheduled to take place on May 11th, and it was none other than the Monaco Grand Prix. If any track could be said to mimic the twisting city street nature of Montjuïc Park, it was Monte Carlo, and after the disaster in Barcelona, there were some major questions to be answered before cars hit the track. Some folks even wondered if the race should go on. The Automobile Club of Monaco leaped into action. It combed the circuit and guaranteed that all bolts holding safety equipment in place were tightened. It added a third layer of Armco barriers at some of the most dangerous areas of the track. It also connected the two lowest rows of Armco with heavy steel plates in hopes of minimizing the chance that a car hitting the barrier could force those two rows apart and the car go between them. They erected wire catch fencing around the entire circuit. They moved curbs and resurfaced certain segments of the road. Then, with a little lobbying from the Ferrari camp, race organizers made the late call to restrict the field of 26 entries to just 18. Among those who failed to qualify were Lella Lombardi and Graham Hill. It would be the final F1 race that Graham Hill would ever attempt. I had a chance to speak with none other than Mario Andretti about the fallout from that race. Andretti in 1975 was competing in his first full season of Formula One with the Vels Pernelli-Jones racing team, so he was on hand to witness both the chaos of the Spanish Grand Prix and the fallout that followed. Did you see anything change as a result of the 1975 Spanish Grand Prix? Was there changes that happened at the races that followed that?
Yes. There was the biggest change was the rear wing.
Mm-hmm.
Big, the tall rear wing right on the uprights and so on and so forth, because there were a couple of failures on that. I even had one during practice in Kyalami fold and get into the rear wheel and so on and so forth. Anyway, so yeah, and that was banned after when Stommelen had that accident. He had the high wing, and that was banned because there was a wing failure that made him go off into the guardrail, and totally out of control. There were many incidents where immediately something changed because the rules didn't cover every aspect of it at that point, because there was the aerodynamic aspect of the car was a work in progress. There were wings, no wings, high wings, low wings, so there was no specific rule.
Can we blame the shoddy construction of the barriers for the deaths that took place at Montjuïc Park in 1975 at the Spanish Grand Prix? It depends on who you ask. I think the general consensus today, at least among people who were not actually present at that race, seems to be that the barriers had something to do with the accident. I think folks learn that there was this back and forth about the quality of the barriers, and then they hear about a car careening into the crowd and assume some kind of barrier failure was involved. But when you dig through the contemporary reporting, I think you draw a much different conclusion. In his post-race report for Motorsport magazine, Dennis Jenkinson writes of the Embassy Hill, the car had not been launched up in the air by the left-hand rails, as some people said, nor had the right-hand rails collapsed. In fact, all around the circuit, the guardrails had been tried and tested and not found wanting. Now, if you have been following along, then I think you know that Jenkinson was not a fan of the driver boycott to begin with, and that he was not shy about reporting the weekend through a lens tinged by his own personal beliefs. So I can understand there is some skepticism in taking his reporting at face value, but even the New York Times reported the same thing. Its post-race report reads, the drivers agreed today, though, that most of the safety precautions had been met by the organizers and that today's accident had nothing to do with the dispute of the last 2 days. The drivers mainly wanted a washer to be put between the nuts and bolts holding the guardrails. That was done, and when Stommelen's car hanged off a rail, it made a big dent in the metal, but the rail held up and slowed down the car, thus possibly saving some lives. Obviously, that's about as good of a conclusion as you can draw from a fatal accident like this one. People were killed. But if those barriers had not been secured, if the drivers had not taken their stance early in the weekend, then that damage almost certainly would have been worse. More lives would have been lost. They weren't, and that is because these drivers stood up for what they felt was right. But I also want to quote a paragraph that Jenkinson uses to close out his race report, because I think it's kind of interesting. It reads, "From faraway Switzerland came cries of 'I told you so,' while the media men disported themselves in all stages, from the philosophical to the hysterical. A lot of people reflected on the whole situation and the position that the extrovert human being holds in society, whether he races cars, motorcycles, powerboats, airplanes, or merely spectates at these activities, or whether he explores holes in the ground, climbs mountains, scans the bottom of the sea, tries to fly like a bird, or fights bulls. The extrovert, whether he be participant or spectator, knows the risks and accepts them. The peace-loving citizen who is beaten up by hooligans and yobs in cities or at football matches not only needs our sympathy, but also our help." To me, it still kind of seems that Jenks retained the perspective that the whole boycott was perhaps a bit overblown, that there was nothing to really take away from the affair other than the conclusion that anyone at the track should understand and accept that they could die whether they're drivers or not. That was a pretty bold stance to take, and I was really glad that I got to speak to Mario Andretti about this mindset among motorsport media, because I wanted to get a better sense of what the drivers actually thought and felt at the time.
Sometimes the journalists thought maybe the drivers were too demanding.
Mm-hmm.
You just mentioned Emerson. Emerson was one of those that he was not afraid to speak up. And that's what it took, because most of the complaints were going to deaf ears, quite honestly. And the press sometimes they have a way of judging. Oh yeah, but if you don't want to be here, just stay home, and so on and so forth.
Was that frustrating to experience as a driver?
Frustrating, yeah. And Dennis Jenkinson was one of those that was not afraid to express, to put out some criticism to someone, right? Quite honestly. Mm-hmm. Knew him quite well, like everybody else. So all along through these decades of change that was coming, a lot of the purists, Dennis Jenkinson was one of them. You have to accept the risk. That's what it's all about. Yeah. That's what makes you a man.
What is something that you wish you could have told journalists at that time? Something that you wish they would have understood from the driver's perspective?
Well, depends. I mean, like I said, to some of those who wake up. I mean, let's face it. It's a negative. Mm-hmm. It's something that we can do something about. Maybe no matter what we do, the sport will never be 100% safe. I mean, that's what makes it interesting as well. Yeah. Obviously, I said, but there are things that we can do. Look at for the longest time, we had fatalities, whether it was in Formula One, IndyCar, or drivers burning to death without a single broken bone from fires. Tell me we didn't have to do something about the fires. Yeah, I was right in the middle. I had been part of that. I had my face burned, Luckily, I got away with a lot of it, but some, like Nicky, didn't. He was disfigured for the rest of his life, even though he could still function, properly. But that affected him and all those things. But again, how could you just not say, let's do something about it and be part of it? Mm-hmm. But some of the, as I said, so-called purists said, oh, be a man, you don't, oh yeah. And a lot of people, made some comments even about the likes of Emerson, that was complaining openly and being a real man to do that, having that courage, yet he was belittled by some of the so-called purist press individuals that said, you know what, just drive the race car, man, and be quiet.
Andretti told me that he didn't remember being part of the boycott, but that his sympathies were naturally with the drivers who had the courage to stand up for themselves and advocate for their own safety as well as the safety of others. One of the big things about the 1975 Spanish Grand Prix was the Grand Prix Drivers Association kind of banding together to basically boycott practice. Were you part of that boycott? Was that something that you were involved in?
No, I wasn't actually, and I'm reading on it now, trying to bring back as much as I could as far as what I remember. I don't remember being or having that as an issue because, you accepted what it was. And, but I fully agree with the organizing as drivers to try to have a voice. Because let's face it, we were the ones that ultimately were going to pay the ultimate price. And then again, but here we got corner workers and spectators that were involved. So something like this it drew a lot of attention. But going back to what you're asking, I don't remember specifically having any of those demands or maybe potentially trying to boycott. Being there with the new team, this was the one and only season that we had with the Parnelli, and it was my way of returning back and trying to commit to full time to Formula One. So as you could see with the new team, all I was worried about is just having a car that I could compete with, and I figured I'll do it if I have to go in open fire.
I was wondering about that as well. Like, you're here with Parnelli Jones, you're here with his new team, an American team coming from American racing into Formula One full time. Did you notice any differences in the way that drivers talked about or responded to safety concerns that were different between America and Europe?
Well, I think in America, in my opinion, we were a little more advanced in that respect because the violence of some of the accidents on the ovals were pretty terrible. I think, as far as the some of the safety, but not just the track safety, but the car safety, we were a little bit ahead of because I can tell you that even the sports cars, I brought to them, to Ferrari, the system that the aviation type refueling, the buckle that they were using, whatever. And after I got half of my body flooded with fuel because of, they had, they were just
dumping it in.
Dumping it in on the side, and oh my goodness. But anyway, but this, nobody could argue. I was totally with the GPDA to great to have a voice, great to make demands and all that. When we started with the catch fencing, which actually backfired a bit, was creating another problem. But at least there was a move forward. And but again, the top drivers of the moment are the ones that had to speak up because those are the ones that everyone listened to. And me as a one-off and so on and so forth, I was just trying to exist at that point, just to come back full time and try to fit in. Believe it or not, the safety aspect was not my priority at that moment.
I can't blame you. You had bigger fish to fry on that one.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
But beyond even that, I greatly appreciated Andretti's perspective on the ways incidents like the 1975 Spanish Grand Prix changed the scope of safety, even in the smallest ways. I was wondering, with the safety conversation, it's easy for folks today. We look back and it's like, oh, maybe that seemed obvious that this change should have been made or should have been made earlier. And I know that maybe I don't think it felt obvious for people at the time that there wasn't quite the same level of understanding of the physics behind what was going on. What do you think are some of the biggest misconceptions people have today when they look back and see what Formula One was and what safety was in the 1970s?
Well, the biggest misconception is that people say, how in the world could you not see?
Yeah.
It sure was. Well, that's the point. Any small improvement was big. because you accepted what you had.
Yeah.
Because everybody else did. So who am I to just be, things should be this and that. So it was a small process.
Mm-hmm.
That's so many years. I'm looking at I think we were making consistent progress through the 80s and 90s. When I came out of the cockpit, I have the car that I drove my very last race, IndyCar, in my garage. And I thought that was the ultimate at that point. I look at it to that. Can you believe the difference? When I was sitting in, how dangerous that was vis-a-vis what we have today. The seat alone, everything, So, and I thought, we're doing pretty good. I think we're reaching the ultimate. The ultimate situation. No, we're not.
Yeah.
That's why today we still keep on going, keep on progressing, keep on making it better. Be honest with you, you should never feel like you've arrived, you've accomplished everything.
Yeah.
I feel my driving, as long as I've been fortunate enough to be having a long career, I felt that I was learning.
Yeah.
The very last race. And the safety aspect should be a work in progress. Never feel, now we have it all covered. I don't think we need to go any further. I think the sport has to remain and be still, have the, some danger to it, which it will no matter what, the speed involved, but don't stop progressing, ever.
Yeah.
And I, quite honestly, like I said, I never felt we had arrived, at any point, just like I never felt that I knew everything I needed to know as a driver.
Mm-hmm. It wouldn't be until later that decade that the burden of safety advocacy was lifted off the shoulders of drivers. Andretti explained to me that because drivers were the only ones actually facing the dangers of competition, for years they were the ones who had to speak up. And men like Emerson Fittipaldi or Jackie Stewart, with all of their success and all of their championships, were the ones who shouldered the bulk of that burden. They had the power and influence to force people to listen. Though as we saw here with the 1975 Spanish Grand Prix, Fittipaldi's firm stance on not racing simply wasn't something the other drivers could afford to mimic, and it meant that he was the only one who refused to start the race. This often made these drivers the targets of derision, both among their contemporaries as well as among fans, team personnel, and media. But one big change came in 1978. Partway through that season, Bernie Ecclestone hired a neurosurgeon named Sid Watkins to serve as Formula One's official doctor. Watkins met with the drivers to understand who they were and get a base sense of their health. That he traveled to all the races on the calendar, where he would serve to monitor driver health and care. This was a big deal. While circuits did need to have some sort of medical center, even, just a medical tent, and some staff on hand in order to host a Grand Prix, the quality of the facilities and the care that you would get there varied from track to track. Watkins would be present as a kind of unifier. He would have motorsport injury expertise, he would be able to evaluate driver health from one weekend to the next, and he could kind of oversee what was going on at these medical facilities and suggest changes. His hiring was met with hostility. Many race organizers felt that it was a slight against them, an accusation that their care wasn't up to snuff. Medical staff felt that Watkins would be hovering over their shoulders judging them. In fact, at the 1978 Italian Grand Prix, police even prevented Watkins from assisting in treating Ronnie Peterson after the start line crash that would go on to take his life. It was a harrowing experience, and Watkins demanded that Formula One provide him with better equipment and guaranteed access to crash sites, or there would be no reason for him to be on staff. Watkins got what he demanded. Watkins clearly had a level of influence that individual drivers simply could not have within Formula One, and that's something that Andretti pointed out as being critical. After Watkins was hired, drivers did not need to publicly advocate for safety improvements. They could instead talk to Watkins about their concern, and Watkins would then present the problem to Formula One officials and demand a solution. It took the target off the drivers' backs and transferred responsibility to a respected, educated expert. It was very easy to tell drivers to man up and ignore their safety concerns, particularly if you could attack the character of that driver in the process. It was much harder to look an authority figure in the eye and tell him he was wrong. But the story of Sid Watkins and his impact on F1 safety is a topic for another episode of Deadly Passions, Terrible Joys. Let's look at what happened to the other folks involved in the 1975 Spanish Grand Prix. Despite a promising initial start to her Formula One career with March Engineering, Lella Lombardi would never again score points. She entered 17 total races in her career, started 12 of them, and crossed the finish line on 7 occasions. In an interview with Autosprint, she laid bare the real concern. "I honestly think that the car is not up to the task. My team tends to give me the leftovers from others, and the car is rarely as good as I would like it to be." This was not simply a complaint on Lombardi's part. It was an expression of immense frustration that has only recently been validated. Her teammate, Hans-Joachim Stuck, confirmed that Lombardi was routinely given the team's least powerful engines. Behind the wheel, she suffered from some frankly shocking handling issues that her team simply refused to take seriously. It was much easier to attribute her poor performance to her gender. Yet in 1976, driver Ronnie Peterson was given Lombardi's old chassis to race, and he complained of its frankly horrifying handling. The team, now convinced that something was actually wrong, took the car back to the shop and stripped it bare. There they discovered the internal bulkhead was cracked. When the issue was repaired, Peterson went on to win a race with that exact chassis. March's technical chief Robin Hurd later reflected, "Poor Lella, she'd had bad traction all along. I feel sorry for her and wonder about it even now. It was one of the few times that she complained about the inequality of F1 because nobody listened to her about the problem with the car. But by the time those problems were discovered, Lella Lombardi's F1 career was over." I also want to take a moment to just address some of the circumstances in which Lombardi scored in Spain in 1975, because I have seen a lot of folks jump at every chance they can to discount the importance of her scoring points. They'll argue that she only scored because people were killed and the race was ended early, that she wouldn't have done so in any other instance, and that it shouldn't count because it's a fluke of a stat. Now, I do not think those arguments hold up under any amount of scrutiny. Lombardi was one of 8 drivers to finish that race. Yes, it only lasted for 29 of the scheduled 75 laps, but there were countless top-notch drivers that wrecked, including world champions, future world champions like Niki Lauda, Alan Jones, James Hunt, and Jody Scheckter. Even if Stammelin's crash had not happened, Lombardi managed to thread through the chaos and very well could have gone on to score points anyway. But making the argument that a record shouldn't be counted in motorsport because it was a fluke is patently absurd. Motorsport is all about flukes. From rain, crashes, red flags, penalties, stewarding decisions, timing errors, these things can happen, they have happened, and they will happen again. It is important that we recognize the context of Lella Lombardi's historic accomplishment, but the fact of the matter was, she was in 6th place when the race was ended. Rookie Tony Bryce, who was making his F1 debut for Williams in Spain, finished 7th. Had he been a little faster, he could have finished in 6th, and he could have brought home that half point, and he would have been just as deserving of it as Lella had been. That is simply the unpredictable nature of racing. Sadly, Lombardi died in 1992 when she was just 50 years old. She'd retired from racing in 1988 after suffering from what she believed was lingering pain from a sailing injury that turned out, instead, to be breast cancer. In an obituary, Autosprint journalist Frank Golini wrote, "Lella only wanted to satisfy herself, no one else, to compete not as a woman against men, but as driver against driver. And she committed herself to it thoroughly. She was convinced that it was only one's approach to racing that made the difference if one had the right machinery. She made racing the sole purpose of her life, and she was fully satisfied, knowing that what she had achieved had always been the maximum possible with the means at her disposal. This is why she lived a happy life." And what of Embassy Hill, the the team whose rear wing failed during one of its first outings as a proper constructor. Sadly, 1975 would be its final year of competition. On November 29th of that year, Graham Hill was piloting a Piper Aztec airplane loaded with key members of the team. Hill, team manager Ray Brimble, driver Tony Bryce, designer Andy Smallman, and mechanics Terry Richards and Tony Alcock were heading back to London after a test session for their 1976 F1 machine that had taken place at Paul Ricard in France. They were scheduled to land late in the evening, but a thick fog had descended, and as Hill attempted to land the plane, he struck some trees. The plane crashed, killing everyone on board. All that remained of the Embassy Hill racing team was deputy team manager Alan Turner and 2 mechanics. Unable to continue, the team's assets were sold off to a Slovenian-Canadian businessman named Walter Wolf, who merged Embassy Hill's assets with those of Hesketh Racing and Williams to form a new team. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of Deadly Passion's Terrible Choice. I will be back next month in May with 2 episodes in honor of the Indianapolis 500. And the first on our list will be a deep dive into a man called Harry Miller, a legendary car builder for the Indianapolis 500 who also had a hand in designing the rear-engine Tucker car and the Jeep. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the show, give it a rating, and leave a review. Let the algorithm know this is the kind of content you'd like to see more of. If you're hungry for more fun motorsport history facts, check out DPTJ on social media, and please subscribe to the DPTJ Substack, where I'm posting weekly blogs about motorsport journalism, critical moments in racing history, and thought-provoking deep dives on the culture that surrounds the sport. Every blog is free for everyone to read, but if you'd like to cast a vote in support of this show, please consider upgrading to a paid subscription. Finally, if you have any questions, comments, concerns, or sponsorship opportunities, or if you just want to say hi, I have an email address for that, deadlypassionsterriblejoys@gmail.com. Finally, we're ending with La Source, the segment named after the iconic turn of Spa-Francorchamps that serves as my bibliography for each episode. It's important to me to cite regularly and accurately, so I'm giving a shout out to some of the most influential sources at the end of each episode, but you can find the full list of sources in the episode description. First and foremost, I have to give a major shout out to Mario Andretti for taking the time to speak with me for this episode. As I was researching, I could not help but notice that everything written about the 75 Spanish Grand Prix was done so by journalists or historians, which, yes, you expect that. But as we talked about in this episode, many of those folks had a lot of strong opinions about what drivers did and should have done. What I wanted, more than anything, was to actually speak to a driver about this. I did reach out to both Emerson Fittipaldi and Jackie Ickx, but I did not hear back. However, I knew that Mario Andretti would be willing to take the time to reflect on that weekend and on the evolution of safety overall in motorsport. And he offered some truly incredible on-the-ground information that I just wouldn't have found anywhere else. Aside from that, I pulled much of my research from the Inimitable Motorsport magazine, the New York Times, and a slew of other publications, all of which will be linked in the description for anyone who wants to dig a little deeper. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Deadly Passion's Terrible Joys. I'll see you next time.